Hi guys, welcome to today's video where I'm actually going to share with you an old live demonstration that I did. I just finished a live demonstration with my class. We painted fluffy white clouds. But this demonstration I'm going to share with you today is one where I painted the eyes in a lion portrait that I did a little while ago. You can tell that the format of the video is a little bit older, it's not quite as polished, whereas now everything I'm doing is in this setting. So if you would like to be part of my tutorial platform where you get monthly live demonstrations that are beautiful, well presented, and really great fun, I would love to see you there. There are more details in the description below, but otherwise please enjoy this video on how I painted highly contrasted, intense eyes of a lion using acrylic paint. I'm gonna go pack this up and I will see you at the end. Welcome to today's live demonstration where I'm going to show you a very straightforward approach to creating both light, bright, sunny effects with the eye as well as shadow effects, and particularly focusing on that value change between the very, very dark shadow eye and the very, very bright sunlit eye. I will show you the detail up close and talk you through what I am doing as I do it. So the live demonstration is going to be running for the first half of what I am doing today. The second half, I will be just doing it on my own and finishing up the eyes so that you can see the process from start to finish. I have a round size 0 and I have a filbert. This filbert is probably just a little bit too big, so I'll opt for a smaller filbert. And the color mixes that I'll be using when you watch the recording later, they will be filmed from the top. This is my palette, so I'll go through the standard colors that I've got here, which is honestly the same for every single painting that we have done so far. I've got Mars Black, Payne's Grey, Raw Umber, Burnt Umber. This is a mixture between Burnt Umber and Raw Sienna. And this is Yellow Ochre. This is a mixture between Raw Sienna and Titanium White. This is Raw Sienna, Titanium White, and a little bit of Burnt Umber. And then off to the side here, I use a little bit of Burnt Sienna and Burnt Umber. And then this is like a little grey mixture that I created using Raw Umber, Payne's Grey, and Titanium White. And then off here, we've got obviously Burnt Sienna and Alizarin Crimson. And then these are all just little tests to create the pinks for the nose, which I'll go through in the main tutorial when that is released in October. And so, sorry, August, not October yet. This here is a liquid glazing medium, but I think by now it's gotten a little bit stodgy, so I'll just remove that. It's pretty gross. And this palette has basically been like this for the past 2 weeks on my Stay Wet palette. And so the paints themselves have actually kept really wet. And I'm very impressed with it because I was hoping that I would be able to use the same palette today, which is perfect. So what I'm going to do, because I can't hold this up while I'm doing the live demo for the screen here, I am going to put this back on the table and I will say out loud what colors I am going to be using as I use them on the surface of the painting. And I'll begin with my standard use of Mars Black, simply to paint the black around the eyes. So basically what I usually always start with is the outlines. These outlines are pretty straightforward. We just have a very young lion cub here. Well, it's an older cub, but it's not a fully grown. So it does have a few younger features. It doesn't have as broad a face or as muscular tones in the face. And so we've got a bit cuter features happening here. So let's just focus on the darkest marks first. And then a standard procedure for me is to go from dark to light. And usually the first few layers, doesn't matter sort of what area I'm working on, the first few layers are always quite broad and generic, and I will then start refining these layers as I add more and more to the painting. So this side here, there's quite a significant change in the tones that I'm going to be using for the eye that's catching the sunlight versus the eye that is fully engulfed in the shadow. And those tones are going to be quite dramatic. I hope that we're able to get right to the end of these layering processes in this tutorial, but if not, I will continue on with the filming so that the entire process is captured in this one film for you to watch later on. So let's carry on and focus on the shape. When we get tucked in underneath the fur that comes down over the top of the eyelid, I tend to go a little bit over, so creating the shadows underneath where the fur is, and it's not necessarily the correct outline to the eye. It's more just an inclusion of shadow that the fur is creating as it comes over the top and comes out from the fur around the eye. And I'm going to switch over, so I have a jar of water off to the side here. I'm going to switch over to burnt umber and start applying some base tones. And any outline that's slightly incorrect, for example, this pupil is a little bit too far over, I will correct as I add more and more paint to this eye. I'll start sort of wiggling it over. You slowly get to know the outlines as you work on the painting, and getting a very opaque finish to a color can usually take a couple of layers. So often people that are working with acrylic try and get this opaque look to the paint straight away, and often that's not possible, just depending on the pigment itself. Let's continue adding some shadow tones around this side here. And you can tell it's really broad, this application. It's quite messy. And I will hop over to the shadow side. And that has very, very deep, almost green tones in it. So on my palette, I am mixing some raw umber and Payne's Grey as my shadow tone. It's very dark compared to the other side of the face. Even the reflection is what I would consider more of a mid-tone than a highlight. So the shadow side here is going to be a fair bit easier to paint than the highlight side because the shadow tones are very simple. And so that is just a straightforward, flat application of raw umber with a little bit of Payne's Grey in it. Now, my brushwork, even though it's messy, it's still sort of imitating the textures and the shape of the muscles within the eye itself. While I wait for this side to dry, because that eye is got a lot of paint on it now, I'm going to hop over to this side and bring in some mid-tone values. So I'm going to use the golden tones that I created for the fur itself. So this is titanium white, burnt sienna, and some, I believe, a little bit of yellow ochre with a tiny little bit of burnt umber in it. And it's just a very consistent mid-tone value that I use a lot in my tutorials, so it's nothing new. So now I'm going to start refining the outline around the pupil and get that a little bit more correct as I go. I'm going to leave a little bit of room for those shadow tones to stick through, and there's a lot of light coming through the top here as well, where the eyelashes are allowing light to show through. So a little bit of that burnt umber was still a bit wet on this surface, which is fine. And it's blending a little bit into this mid-tone. So I'm just bringing in, I'm basically just mapping the light here. I'm not going to vary between the tones too much. but I'm just sort of focusing on getting the basic structure down and getting to know the eye as a structure to look at. All right, so because that is now a very wet layer, I'm going to hop back over to this eye over here and bring in some slightly lighter and a little bit more green in there. So I'm going to create green using yellow ochre and Payne's grey. This is, I'm just simply going to use that for now rather than adding any other colors to it. And I'm just going to experiment to see how it looks. So it stands out quite a lot on the surface here, but it's still quite a deep shadow tone. And it's bringing in those greens and the depth here that I'm really enjoying seeing. So I'm going to add a rather broad application of this across the base. So even though it's all in the shadow, there's still elements of this eye that are catching quite a fair amount of light. And we will make these shadow tones a bit deeper with my raw umber and possibly even a little bit more black. But for now, I'm going to use some more raw umber to create that opacity that we like to see, so that we're covering up those slightly lighter tones from the tone of the panel. And now I'm just going to grab some pure Payne's grey, which is going to bring in a lot more depth into that shadow. So straight into that raw umber. The paint is still very wet, and I'm just going to bring that in closest to the shadow underneath the eyelid, and then around the edge. And that, I'm going to allow that to dry. So I'm basically establishing the darkest parts of the shadow in a little bit more of an opaque way. My brushwork is very rough. I haven't created any refined details at the moment. I'm just getting the color in there. So it is catching a fair amount of light at the moment, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in some pure Mars black around the side and into the pupil, which will strengthen those shadow tones in there as well and create a little bit more definition, because right now it's just a blurry mess of color. On this side now, I'm going to bring in some pure raw sienna, because this is a very bright sunny color. It's a little bit darker than the colors that we've added already, and it's sort of going to enhance that yellow. And then I'm going to bring in some burnt sienna, which is a little bit more brown, but it's still got that golden look to it. And I'm just sort of very lightly squiggling that in, very close to mimicking the shape of the muscles in the eyes. So those circular muscles around the pupil. Using burnt sienna again to just kind of keep adding this slightly darker brown golden tone. And I will just keep working that in a little bit away from the pupil. The lighter tone is a little bit is wet still, but that's allowing me to blend it in there as well. And I'm going to bring this around. So we need to start bringing in the shape, and I will come in again with the light tones. So the shape of the eye, because it is circular, we are going to need to make these edges just a little bit darker, which will give us that ball look to it. And we're going to bring in this darker tone just to bring in the texture of the eye. All the way up the side. It's not enough to simply add a light tone to an eye that's under intense light, because it actually magnifies the texture. And so we get a very clear view of the textures that are within the eye, and we're able to then really focus on maximizing those. So we've got a lot of texture happening here, and what I'm going to do as I add more layers, the lights will start to get very clear in there, and you'll be able to really see those muscles, and the shadow is going to be, the change between light and dark is going to be very, very sudden rather than here on the shadow side where it's a softer blend and it's much more subtle. So now I'm using a darker mid-tone value, which is created with the burnt umber and raw sienna. And now this is a slightly more muted shadowy tone. That's because of the burnt umber, but it's still a bit more sunny than what it would be if we just used raw umber or went for just straight burnt umber at this stage. I will use burnt umber again as a glaze, as something that will really enhance the shadow tones. But now I'm sort of just focusing on the marks that we see with the darker tones. So even though it's not the darkest tone that I will be using, I'm starting to focus on the texture and the detail within the eye. And I'm purely just choosing what looks the most obvious. I'm not really following a specific structure. I'm just going from dark to light and following the colors that seem to make the most sense for me. I would like to start bringing in an even darker mid-tone value, so I'm using some burnt umber, and I'm going to use this in a way that will show the eyelashes a little bit stronger. So the shadows from the eyelashes are very clear and very, well, stripy. It's just a lot of lines that come across the eye. And I'm going to obviously come across with some lighter tones again to redefine the gaps in the light. But I want to bring in these darker tones so that I can start defining these individual streaks and stripes in the eye. Once I've applied this dark layer, I will allow it to dry before adding the rest of the mid-tones, and then the highlights eventually will come in, and that will then sort of bring everything together. So I'm just adding this burnt umber, and then I will move over to the shadow side to add the next layer. I will bring in some more black into this eye as we go. All right, so let's hop over to the shadow side, and I'm going to use my Mars black again and really, beg your pardon, and really define the shadow in here. So the shadow is obviously the features, so the difference between where the pupil is versus the rest of the black in the eye. It's kind of hard to find that clear differentiation between the areas. So I'm going to use a little bit of my artistic license and create a little bit more clarity within the eye. And it's not something that I see in the reference photo, but it's something that I kind of know exists just based on previous work with eyes. And that is going to come out when I use the reflection. So I'm going to enhance the reflection just a little bit. And I'm using the black to just add the shadow right up into the corner here. So there's a question from Rowley. Do you have any advice for how to gauge the brightness value in the shadow side? Honestly, the brightness value, when you have a comparison like this, can be fairly straightforward. The brightness value will come through experience, I guess, through a lot of trial and error, but what we've got between the comparison here is this dark side when you're looking at the reference photo. So let me show you the reference photo. It's quite a significant drop in the value system. And what we've got here is extremely bright values versus extremely dark values. And so you can basically use pure black as your starting point for this sort of depth. And then you can add slowly lighter and lighter and lighter midtones. It's not really going to look right until you've worked on both sides and you start creating the balance between the light and dark and the values on both sides. I usually notice that people don't put enough contrast. So I would start off with what you might consider to be too much contrast and then tone it down rather than going the safe route and not having enough. So now I'm going to use a little bit of Payne's Grey and a tiny little bit of titanium white because there is a little bit of light catching the eyelid on this side of the shadow. Because the light is coming from this side, the eyelid around the eye catches just a little bit of light. So what I'm doing here is adding a bit too much brightness, and then I will blend that in with a glaze of black. But this is quite an important element when refining the outline of the eye because it's giving us a border basically to the eye itself. So now I'm coming in with a glaze and I'm just softly blending in that Payne's Grey and titanium white. It was a very dark mixture of Payne's Grey and titanium white, and you'll see me use it on this side as a highlight, which will be a much more obvious clear brightness. And what this has simply done is just given us a tiny, tiny little bit of light on the eyelid, which is great. It's going to help us a lot. So I've got on my palette a little grey tan mixture of a little bit of Payne's Grey, a little bit of raw umber and titanium white. And I'm just going to use that along the edge of this eye where there's some reflected light coming in. And I'm going to bring in a tiny little bit of light there. I'm going to use a little bit more Payne's Grey in that mixture, give it a little bit more blue, and then start making it a bit more green and slightly darker as I get closer to the inside of the eye here. And that's going to allow me to add a little bit more texture to the eye. And this is definitely the lightest that I would go on this side, because if you make an eye too light that is in the shadow of a portrait, it'll start looking like it's glowing, which is obviously very effective if you want to create that effect with your artwork, but it also doesn't look very realistic. And so I don't want this side to be too light. I want the reflection to be beautiful in the eye and the overall moisture to be captivating, because that is sort of the easiest way to convey intensity and emotion is through how you include the moisture. So specks and specks of moisture throughout and the reflection. So because this overall portrait is quite golden, I'm going to use yellow as the reflection rather than blue. Now, blue would be effective in the situation where there was a lot of sky and a lot of light, but because we're in the shadow here, it's obviously not being exposed to that. So I've got a very light mixture of yellow on my brush, and I'm just going to use this yellow. It's a mid-tone yellow, so it's created with raw sienna and a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of yellow ochre. And I'm going to use that as a way to capture the light. So I wouldn't say that I've finished the detail in this shadow eye. I'm jumping over to the highlights because I want to gauge how much more I need to do in order to make this part of the eye look like it has been finished or is to a point where I can start finishing it, or if there's still more detail that I need to add in order to achieve that. So I often do that throughout my tutorials. I will encourage you to hop over to adding the highlights or doing something that is sort of a shortcut to your process, just to gauge how many more layers you need to add. So this yellow I'm going to bring in on the inside of the eye as well. This is simply a catch of reflected light, and it's a very effective way to add just a little bit more intensity to the eye as you add more light in there without creating that glow effect. So as we have this part of the eye that has the eyelid on it, I'm adding a few drops of moisture along there, like it's got moisture between the eyeball and the eyelid. And that's sort of going to create a little bit more differentiation in there. It is hard to see. And that has kind of made the eye look a little bit more finished. And I'm going to bring a little bit more Mars Black in here and just really give that shape a good outline right in there. So this part of the eye, I would say, is as far as I would take it for now, before finishing this light section here on the side. And there's probably going to need to be a little bit more massaging of the shape and the size, but in terms of the layering and the process, that's what I would do. And so let's go over to the light section, where I am going to start with a layer of Mars Black just to create some very, very definite outlines now. So as we've added more layers to this painting, it's lost its clarity, which is fine because it's all part of the layering process. And so I'm going to bring those darker tones back in now. And especially where the eyelashes are casting a shadow, I'm going to bring in some much darker marks just to clarify that. I don't want to make it too dark because otherwise it's not going to look realistic. There's always a little bit of fine lines coming out from the pupil and then the shadow cast from the eyelashes. I find it to be a very effective thing to paint. I am going to bring in a little bit of the fleshy color, so a light blue tone that comes here. It's Payne's Grey, a darker Payne's Grey and titanium white than what I'll be using in the reflection. And it's just going to give us this outline here to the eye. And then there's a little bit of a captured light section here on the side. So now I'm going to start bringing in the light because this is a beautiful part of the process and I always get really excited when it gets to this part. And there's light on this side as well of the eyelid. So the eyelid tends to get quite textured when you start getting to the outside. And that is then where the hair follicles start to form and then it goes out into hair. So I'm just going to start bringing in dabs of this light blue tone. So there is a section of light very strong over here, which I'll add at the end. And then there is light coming in on the black over here and some bursts of moisture, which add these very, very bright glistening bits of light. So starting to add these highlights is really useful because you're able to then gauge just how much more light you need to add to it. We already know that I need to add lots more light to it, and seeing the highlights there really emphasizes that. So now I'm getting a mixture of yellow ochre and titanium white. It's got a little bit of raw sienna in it just to sort of tone it down. And I'm going to use this where the sunlight is most bright. So I'm now creating the brighter sections of the eye. And as you can see, I'm painting a little bit into the eyelash sections. And that's going to really make this eye stand out. This is probably the best part about the process. So there's some very bright areas along this inside ridge of the eye that will require a little bit more titanium white to make it super clear. And my brushwork is going to be a little bit sketchy so that I'm bringing in that texture just simply with the texture of the brushwork itself. And right up into the ridge of muscle in the iris along the pupil, there's a little catchment of light. And this is a very subtle part of the detailing. But I find that if I don't include this part in the portrait, it loses so much more detail. Like there's just something more interesting about capturing that ridge of the muscles along the edge of the pupil. And so I highly recommend, if you're able to focus on that, really bring that ridge in line and bring that detail in. So I'm using a slightly darker version now. So this has got a little bit more raw umber as I move into the darker section of the sunny eyeball. And I'm just bringing in as much light as I can, but I don't want to have to really glaze over this section if I can avoid it. So that's why I've opted for a slightly darker version. And so just simply keep adding, just keep following what you see. I'll bring this in a little bit more. So as I get closer underneath the eyelid, the highlights are getting a little bit darker. So I'm using a slightly darker mid-tone, but it's still something that I would consider to be fairly light for this painting. So I've gone for a thicker application of the highlight here, which makes it more opaque. And you can start to see that it's really catching the light now. And when you see this in a closer view, you'll see the little bits of texture that is starting to capture as I keep adding the paint here. So I'm just using slightly darker versions as I creep further away from where the light is the strongest in the eye. And it's just going to get more and more dark as I get closer to this side. You're also going to notice, so I'll end this tutorial on the brightest highlight because it's also important for me to be able to show you this. Where the eye is usually darkest, especially in an eye like this where the light is so strong, the brightest reflection is going to be on the darkest side. So the light enters, so this side of the muscle, because it curves slightly outwards, the actual anatomy of this eyeball, this side is really catching the light because the surface is facing a little bit towards the light source, but the reflection is going to be on the darkest. side of the eye. So you're going to get that bright burst of light in the reflection on this side rather than on this side. And that's going to create quite a clear difference. So the contrast is greater simply because of where the shadow is in the eye versus the reflection. And that's going to really create depth and make your eye really interesting to look at. Okay, so that's probably the most important thing to note about when you get an eye that has this much light on it. So as I'm adding these lighter tones, it is getting darker as we creep up this way. And so what I'm going to do now is bring in that bright burst of light. So I like to tone down the first application of this reflection. So I'm going to use titanium white and Payne's grey. It is a slightly blue version of the white, and I will add a couple layers of this. So that is basically the section that has the light. And then I'm just feathering it out so it's not a super clear ball. I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's grey in there just to soften the brightness on the edges of the reflection. So not the brightest innermost part of the reflection. That is now where I get a tiny bit of titanium white on my brush. And I add that as thickly and as opaquely as possible to that section. And then I wipe off the brush off, wipe off the excess paint off my brush. And then I just very lightly blend that big dob of titanium white into that lower layer of the brighter, of the Payne's grey titanium white mixture. I'm getting titanium white on my brush again. And we will add the light here on the opposite side where it's brightest. And I'm just almost dry brushing that into the layers of paint that I've added. To bring that light in there. So this is now the brightest part of this portrait. And it's going to give me a foundation to work with in terms of gauging that value system, which Riley asked about earlier. So I'm just getting some of the darker yellow before I continue on with that line of thought and just blending that white in. So we've got the white is in there and it's just being blended in. So in order to gauge that value system, I wouldn't say gauge it on a large scale too much. You need to do it every now and again, but rather do elements at a time as you go. So I'm gauging the value scale of this eye first before I see how it impacts the rest of the portrait. And this is going to come across a little bit. So there'll be bursts of this light catching the edges of the muscle throughout this section here. As I get further away from it, I will get slightly more yellow onto my brush, but bring that texture in there. And now I want to get a little bit more of that titanium white because this section here is also catching quite a lot of light. And so I want to bring tiny dab of highlight here to really catch as much light as I can. So we're grabbing the light coming across the eye here, and that just straight away makes it come together. Now I'm going to bring in some bright dabs of light here to the moisture because these are, so I'm not going to blend this titanium white in. This is like bright moisture highlights. So I'm going to move back over to the shadow eye, and I want to make sure that the size is correct between the two. Because as I've been adding layers, I'm starting to feel like the size of this eye on the left is a little bit smaller than the size of the eye on the right. So this is measuring at 5 centimeters. and it's actually the opposite. So there you go. It is the opposite. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that. I'm going to check the vertical. So that's just under 3. And that's right on 3. So they're actually very, very similar in size. And it's as simple as using a measuring ruler to check that the sizes match. So it's a trick of light, which is very interesting. And I think the best way around that for me going forward is to ignore the size and just focus on the tone. Because as I add more depth into the fur around this eye, I think it will balance it more and make it appear more similar in terms of the size difference. So let's just focus on the tones and getting those correct and then move on from there. So I'm just going to extend some shadow tones out the side into the fur and the surrounding areas just to start bringing these tones a little bit closer together. Make that a little bit more correct. Often the surrounding elements to the eye will have just as large an impact on the actual detail in the eye itself. So we can't neglect the surroundings today. We are going to focus a little bit on those before we move on too far. The pupil in this shadow eye is actually very hard to see in the reference photo. So I am going to need to make this eye a lot darker than what I have made it. But I am going to allow my artistic license to keep that light in there because I don't want it to be too dark, but like I said, I don't want it to be too light either. So let's try and establish a balance here that is going to allow me to do both. I'm just putting a little bit of water on my brush and I'm going to start adding some textures to the fur around here. So we're just going to make this texture a little bit better because what that's going to do, it's going to change the shape ever so slightly, and it's also going to make the eye appear a little bit bigger. So this is the shadows in the fur that is going around the outside of the eye. And then of course there's quite a strong black mark on this side here too. I'm just going to add the black because that is actually going to have quite a big impact on the overall value of the shadows within the eye that we rest on, that we decide, yep, it's finished with. So remember that the surrounding light is going to have a large impact on what you ultimately decide is right for the eyes that you're painting. Right, and then I'm going to bring in a slightly darker grey tone in here and blend this part in, maybe a little bit more raw umber. All right, so I'm toning that back a little bit and it's changing that perception on the light in the eye quite a bit, and I'm going to leave the front there because that is a bit lighter. And the key thing here is that we're going to have these very, very bright marks of light coming over the top because the light that's coming across the face is catching the ends of the fur coming up and out in the eye here. And that is going to be like the cherry on the cake for this section here. It's going to finish it off beautifully. And it's going to be hard for me to resist adding that for the purpose of this tutorial. But I think I will at the end because it'll really make it come alive, even though I'll end up painting over it to finish this portrait later on. These bright strips of light are just going to make it pop. So it's going to be the ultimate finish for this tutorial. And so let's add a little bit of fur detail here. I think I need to make that a little bit warmer. So I'm using a darker mid-tone, which would be a shadow tone for that side, but for this side it is bright enough. And I'm going to add a few details to the fur around the eye, which we will ultimately paint over with some very bright highlights, but right now I'm just bringing in the idea that it is there. And so we're just going to slowly add more and more layers to the fur. Obviously, I'm not focusing on fur for this tutorial. It's just literally what I'm doing here. And this is just going to be a base for me to add those really bright tones at the end there. And I'm just going to glaze it a little bit and then add the final little dabs of light in there. So what I have added here is just a base for us to work on. I'm going to bring in a little bit more pure raw umber over these dark blue tones just to create a little bit more warmth in there, but I'm only doing it very subtly. So it's a way to add a little bit more depth, and it's kind of like a dry brushing effect. There's a very small amount on my brush right now. Raw umber also has those green undertones, and so we're sticking to tones that really work with what is in the reference photo. And I'm kind of scribbling this raw umber onto that surface there, and it's creating those lines that you see in the iris. And I'm only applying it closer to the edge and then through the center where the two groups of muscles meet in the iris. And then I'm using it along the edge just to create that softness, so it's not as hard a line between the light and the dark, blending that in a little bit more. And then right in the shadow so that it's very hard to see that pupil. So we are sticking to something that we see in the reference photo. So I've still got a lot of that blue showing through, and we've got the reflected light there. So now that we've steepened that contrast in the eye, it makes that reflection a little bit stronger, and it's actually quite nice. So I'm going to make a little adjustment to that reflection. I'm going to add a little bit more light, but I'm only doing it in a very, very small portion of it because I don't want to make this glow. I want it to be bright, but not glowing. So I'm being very careful with that balance. And that's about all the light I want to add. So I'm going to add a little bit more of this green and gray that I created just opposite where I just added that light. Same principle as I explained with this light. We've got the opposing, the brightness, so the brightest reflection is on the darkest side of the eye, but because of the shape of the muscles within the eye, it catches the light on the other side. So the brightest part of the iris is opposite the bright highlight on top of the cornea. So the reflecting light on top of the surface of the eyeball. So I'm adding this in a very sketchy way once again, just to illuminate those textures that are catching the light, those muscles, the fibers, and it's just catching a little bit of light on the inside. Now that I would say is too bright. So I am going to tone it down just a little bit using my darker mixture of yellow ochre and Payne's grey. So it's got that green look to it. But you almost need that light base there so that you have a little bit more of an opaque layer to apply this darker color to. Again, it's like your opacity layer. And so right up against the pupil, once again, there is a very subtle light there. So catching the light, same as on this side, is a very subtle ridge of muscle, even in the shadow side. So there's still that use of detail. And then I'm just going to redefine that pupil. All right. So I'm happy with that in terms of the shadow in the eye. I might just add a little bit more. Oh, this is one of those things I can just keep adding more and more to and never really finish. So I'm just going to call it. And for your benefit, I'm going to add bright strip of light across the top. This is just playful, just so that you can see what I mean. And it's going to be bright highlight, and I am going to tone it down just a little bit because otherwise it just might look a little bit odd. So I'm using the golden tones because ultimately it is fur that's catching the golden light from across that side. And as you add layers to such a golden color to make it more vibrant and more light, as you add more, especially to the surrounding fur, once you get to that stage, then it becomes easier to add the brighter tones because it makes more sense. So I'm using my round size 0, and I'm just going to very carefully, very, very lightly, I wonder if I should use my liner actually for these light marks. I'm going to switch over to my liner. So my liner just, I prefer using a liner for doing these very, very fine marks. Because it just, I feel like I've got more control. And I'm going to glaze the ends of them so that they blend. So very fine brushwork here. And now I've got one eyelash, eye hair coming down like that. There you go. So as you can see, the more I add, the more clear this becomes and makes more sense. It's very nerve-wracking adding these lines when it's not technically time to do it. So the fur along here is obviously very clear and catching the light. So using the liner, you can just sort of like dab it in there. And as you spread this light further out over the portrait, it really ties it in. So these marks will become brighter and brighter as I add more of the light to the portrait. And especially when you've got it compared to the bright section on the sunlit area, it comes together much better. So the contrast here is not quite right because what I need to do is add some burnt umber to really deepen the contrast between the light tips of the fur and the base of them and create that blend. But for now, purpose of this tutorial, this is what I'm going to do for you. So you can even add little bits of moisture on the end, which is just a little dab of extra light. They do obviously need to be a bit lighter to really capture that. But I am going to just blend a little bit of that in. So I'm going to use some raw umber. You can also use it to correct anything that has gone mishapped in shape. My words are failing me. And so add a little glaze to the end of those hairs. So once you add that first strip of highlight, you glaze it back a little bit, give it that depth, push it back in so that you've got clear differentiation between where the root of that hair is and where the tip is. And then you can come back in with bursts of more highlight to redefine the tips and sections of the hairs that are really catching the light. So there you go. I'm going to leave it like that. I can obviously keep going for ages, like just keep adding just a little bit more light, but that's okay. I'm going to leave it there, which is very hard for me to do because I want to just go on and finish it. So during the live demo, we created a beautiful base to a very vibrant eye. And I got to the stage where I could bring all the layers together and really tie it up. But what I want to do now is add that yellow brilliance, basically, to the eye. And I'm going to do so using a glaze of yellow ochre. And this is essentially going to give a very yellow tint to the lighter areas of this eye. So it's hard to get a very clear yellow ochre color when you're mixing in a lot of other tones. And the yellow ochre is quite a warm, earthy yellow. And so using it as a glaze creates a higher saturation of this golden yellow tone. Whereas when you start adding titanium white to it, you get a little bit more of a pastel color to those, basically any color that you use titanium white in. And so using a color pure, such as yellow ochre or even raw sienna, basically any color, when you use it pure without any added mixtures, and you use it as a glaze, it comes out really saturated, like really saturated, and it's beautiful to work with. I do this demonstration a little bit more vividly in a hummingbird metallic feather tutorial, and it really shows you how to create those saturated tones. So this tutorial is more focused on the eye and creating the details in the eye. So I'm going to just keep on track. But that is how I'm creating that more vibrant yellow. So I'm going in again with a slightly darker tone after adding that pure yellow ochre as a glaze. And I'm bringing in a little bit more detail over the surface of the eye, a little bit more light as well, especially here along the pupil. And I'm doing it very carefully. My brushwork is controlled and I'm not over emphasizing the brushwork. It's very subtle. And now I'm just going to lightly bring it down into the iris. So I'm going to use some darker midtones to redefine those shadow lines across the iris created by the eyelashes. For now, I'm just focusing on bringing in some lighter tones, which I can glaze over again if need be. So don't worry about thinking everything's set in stone here. So now the final touches for this eye are going to come in the form of glazes. And the glazes are going to be softer uses of darker tones. So I'm going to use a little glaze of raw sienna here, very gently across some of these yellow tones. This just creates a little bit more of a golden sort of like glow to the eye. I'm going to do so all the way around, basically where I see it in the reference, adding a little bit more color rather than it just being purely yellow. Burnt sienna can be quite a vibrant tone actually when it's used as a glaze. I'm going to bring it into the muscles in the eye, the radial muscles, I believe they're called, and across the side. So the edge of this eye is actually quite colorful here, and it's got a fair amount of blending. So I'm just going to make sure that that is done really well to finish off this section. I'm going to use some burnt umber now. So the burnt umber is really creating that clear linear mark that the eyelashes are casting over the shape of the eye. And I'm working really fine here. I'm not adding a lot of pressure. My brushwork is very, very controlled. That comes in along into the light on the side of this eyeball here. So now there's a little bit of pink flesh. So still keeping my burnt umber on my brush, I'm just adding a little bit of alizarin crimson and titanium white to it. And we're just going to add a little bit of pink flesh onto the side here. And then on the eyelid itself, it's catching just a little bit of light. So all these little fiddly details we can add as we get closer to it being finished. It's going to need a little bit more white. Again, I'm not washing my brush, I'm just going straight in because those tones will soften the titanium white that I pick up on my brush. Going to use a little bit of blue now to bring in those blue tones. Let's make it a little darker. That starting to look pretty finished. So I'm going to increase the intensity of light on the opposite side here. Almost like an overexposure of light. I'm going to blend it in. So a little bit of dry brushing happening here. Really like it. It's really come out lovely. And I think, to be honest, I am happy to leave it like that because now I've got the working around of the light around the eye. So in all the fur, basically, around this entire eye is what I'm going to have to work on in order to really bring the values onto a balanced scale. So creating these light furs, like what is only a small amount on the shadow side, is all of the right-hand side here. It is just super bright. So this is just going to bring in a little bit of yellow next to that burst of light on the top of the eye there. Just to blend that in schmiddle a little bit. And blend that in with a little bit of burnt umber. If you enjoyed that tutorial and would like to see more from me, please subscribe and share these videos. I also have a tutorial platform where I share a whole lot more, both acrylic and oil. So I would love to see you there. There's a free trial and everything. So follow the links in the description and also email me if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you. So until the next video, bye-bye for now.